במלכותך, ישמחו במלכותך. שומרי שבס וכהני יויני, וכהני יויני. דידיי Shabbos kodesh, Shabbos kodesh, oy oy. Shabbos kodesh, Shabbos kodesh, dididoy oy. Shabbos kodesh, ay ay. Shabbos kodesh, oy oy. Shabbos kodesh, Shabbos kodesh. Give Shabbos Shabbat Shalom. Hey. Oy, yismechu b'malchutcha, yismechu b'malchutcha.
Good evening, my holy sisters and brothers. Tonight is gonna be a great show. We are covering some really interesting material. I'm sure that's why we just had a glitch getting the streaming going. So pardon me for being a few minutes late, but let's light up the darkness. All right, who is with us as we do some truly beautiful learning on a Sunday night? Yehudit in Florence, South Carolina. Paula in the far north suburbs of Chicago. Melissa in Great Neck. James in Indianapolis. John in Lewiston, Maine. Catherine DeYoung. Kit in Oregon. So is Kit a place or is that the nickname for Catherine? Let me know. Gwen says, good evening from Michigan. Tom, wishing everyone a good week to all our friends. Dorothy says, shalom from Pennsylvania. Lucy in Minnesota. Rebecca in LA. Dorothy loves that song. That was Rabbi Shlomo Katz. We play that album all the time live in Melbourne. It's a great double live album. Awesome. That song opens his concert. Yismechu b'malchutcha. They shall delight in the sovereignty of the Lord, those who keep Shabbos. Right? It's a really wonderful promise there. I think it's from Isaiah. And the idea is, if you don't look at Shabbos as, oh man, once a week I'm not allowed to turn on my computer, but rather Shabbos is this treat, this gift that we're given once a week when we can just stop everything and, relish our relationships with each other, with God. Then we'll realize that, God is really our holy parent in heaven who blesses us with all these commandments and this order, this commandment, right? The fourth commandment of the 10 commandments to keep Shabbos is an absolute gift. And then we will, we'll just be so happy that we've been commanded to keep it. At any rate, Stephen in Dover, New Hampshire, Lindy in Texas, Albert in Wink, Texas, Carol in Cleveland, Sharon in Lebanon, Stephen in Oklahoma, Nancy in North Carolina, Renee in Indiana, William who's Bill in South Carolina. Kit is Catherine's nickname. Thank you. Sheila in upstate New York. And Albert says, love the singing and lighting of the candle. Look forward to listening to the message. Amen. So glad that you're here. Over on the YouTube side, Lynn in North Texas, Aoife in Ocala, Florida, and Gigi wishing everybody Shavua Tov a good week. Okay. First of all, we're dedicating tonight's learning to the healing of Miriam Bas Rivka. May she have a complete and speedy recovery, and we all say Amen. We are starting just a little bit into page 25 here in Tractate Sukkah, the 7th volume of the Talmud. This is chapter 2. We're on the 6th Mishnah. Tonight we're going to read the 6th Mishnah and open our discussion of it. And this is a fascinating Mishnah. General topic: is one obligated in the mitzvah of Sukkah, to dwell in the Sukkah during the festival of Sukkot, if he is at the same time engaged in fulfilling another mitzvah? He's fulfilling some other commandment. He or she is fulfilling some other commandment. Do they need to stop and fulfill their obligation with respect to the Sukkah? And that's going to bring in this broader question: is a person who is engaged in fulfilling a mitzvah, what's the word I'm looking for? Excused from fulfilling other mitzvahs during that time, right? So when you're engaged in fulfilling a mitzvah, that takes precedence over everything, including other mitzvahs, or not. Maybe not. Maybe there's some mitzvahs, no matter what, when the time comes to fulfill that mitzvah, even though you are engaged in performing a different mitzvah, you should stop that, do the one whose time has come, and then return to the one that you were on the path to. Which is it? That's what we're going to be discussing tonight. And in that discussion, we're going to talk about something that the sages were very concerned with, which is the obligations of a groom on his wedding night. So this is a really interesting discussion tonight, and it's a compact discussion. So I don't expect a long class, but we're going to cover some really, really interesting materials. So let us get to it. Mishnah number 6 here in chapter 2 of Tractate Sukkah. Those on the path to perform a mitzvah, to fulfill a commandment, are exempt from the mitzvah, the commandment of Sukkah. Right? So the commandment is during the holiday of Sukkot, which is a week long, we are commanded to dwell in the Sukkah, which, as we've discussed, means sleeping in it, if possible, but certainly taking our meals in it. Okay? But those who are on the path to perform a mitzvah are exempt from the mitzvah of Sukkah. The ill and their caretakers are exempt from the mitzvah of Sukkah. One may eat and drink a casual meal outside the Sukkah. Right? So what does that mean? The difference between a casual meal and a meal? A meal is one that includes bread, so that you would wash your hands and then make the blessing over bread. That's a meal, a formal meal. If you're just eating some food kind of casually, we would otherwise call that a snack. You don't have to take your snack in the Sukkah, but if you're having a meal during Sukkot, you must have that meal in a Sukkah. Right? So that is the Mishnah. Now let's get into the Gemara, the discussion of this Mishnah. The Gemara asks, from where are these matters derived? That one who is performing a mitzvah is exempt from the mitzvah of Sukkah. The sages taught in a baraisa, so a contemporaneous teaching with the Mishnah, slightly less authoritative, that it is written in the Torah that one recites Shema, right, the morning and evening recitation of the words from the Torah. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. When we declare the unity of God, we must say that in the morning and in the evening. So the sages taught in a baraisa that it is written in the Torah that one recites Shema at the following times, right? This is the paragraph that says when we say the Shema. When do we have to say the Shema? When you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. Now, does that mean we say the Shema 4 times a day? No, it does not. We say the Shema in the morning and in the evening. So why are these 4 times given? It already says when you rise up and when you lie down. That would indicate morning and evening. So what about when you sit in your house and when you lie down? What is intended by those words? The sages interpret, when you sit in your house, this is to the exclusion of one who is engaged in the performance of a mitzvah, right? Somebody who is engaged in doing a mitzvah, or he's either doing some mitzvah, fulfilling a commandment, one of the 613 commandments of the Torah, or he is on his way to perform that mitzvah. So he's doing whatever is necessary in order to perform the mitzvah. For example, a father is commanded to get his son circumcised on the 8th day. That's a commandment on the father. If he is, gathering the people for the circumcision, if he's bringing the knife for the circumcision, if he's bringing the baby to the place where it's going to be circumcised, those are all actions which are appertinent to performing the mitzvah. All right, so when you sit in your house, this means that you're not engaged in performing a mitzvah and not on the path to perform a mitzvah. And that's when you're obligated to say Shema. So if you are on the path to perform some other mitzvah or in the middle of performing the mitzvah, you are not obligated to say the Shema. And when you walk by the way, what does that mean? This is to the exclusion, a very specific thing here that the sages interpret. When you are walking by the way, or when you walk by the way, this is to exclude a groom who is preoccupied with his mitzvah, his commandment of consummating the marriage on the wedding night, and is not walking along the way, right? This is somebody, right, who is, he doesn't have to get there. He's in the place where he's going to be performing the mitzvah, but it's not the time to perform it yet, and he is preoccupied. He is thinking about it. He's a little worried about it, right? I mean, traditionally, the groom and the bride were very young. They've never been engaged in these kinds of activities before their wedding night. And so the groom is worried, right? And so when he's worried about that mitzvah, he just doesn't have the right mindset to perform other mitzvahs. The Baraisa adds that from here, the sages stated, one who marries a virgin is exempt from reciting Shema on his wedding night, and one who marries a widow is obligated. And they don't really explain that. They're going to give a little bit of an explanation. So it might be, okay, perhaps the groom is concerned, right? And this is also in the ancient world where a man could have multiple wives. So he doesn't have to be a virgin. He might already be married. He was presumably a virgin before the first time he got married, but he might be marrying another wife. Eventually that was outlawed. It is outlawed to have multiple wives in Jewish law, but in the early times that was possible. So here the sages are suggesting that he's concerned not about his own performance, but about whether or not she's a virgin, because if she's not a virgin, well, this is going to throw everything, be very problematic. And with a widow, that's not a concern, because clearly she's not a virgin, so there's no issue about that. Also not stated, but could be part of this calculus, as it were, right? If she's a virgin and he's a virgin and nobody knows what they're doing, there's a lot more to worry about than if there's at least one experienced partner in the equation. And what is the law about this? A groom and Shema. A groom who marries a virgin is exempt from reciting Shema, even for 2 or 3 days following the wedding, until he consummates the marriage, due to concern that as a result of his preoccupation, he might not have the proper intent when reciting Shema. That was the halacha, the law, in earlier generations. However, in later generations, like now, when it is the norm to recite Shema without proper intent, a groom is obligated to recite the Shema. So this excuse no longer holds. A groom, even on his wedding night, is obligated to recite the Shema. Now, this is fascinating. We are learning here that in earlier generations, when they said the Shema, when they said, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one," and we know that when you're actually saying that, you not only close your eyes, but you cover your eyes. We've discussed this before. And if you are not saying these words with the explicit intent in your mind, you're not going to say this out loud, but the explicit intent in your mind to accept the yoke of heaven, meaning, I submit to God. I submit to all of God's commandments to me. I'm not a solo player in this world. I'm not here randomly. I am a soul. God sent me here for a reason. He gave me these commandments for my benefit. I want to fulfill them as best that I can. And I'm going to say this morning and evening. And when I say these words, I'm saying everything in this world is within God. There is only God. God commands everything. God commands everything for good reason, and he's commanding me. All of that is wrapped up into Shema. And in earlier times, people got that and said it with the correct intent. And nowadays, our whole observance, our whole spiritual level has fallen so much lower that nobody is really saying it with the correct intent. Now, does that mean we're excused from saying it with the correct intent? No, it's just that's the reality. In fact, tragically, most Jews in the world aren't saying Shema at all. They've become so distant from Torah and from God. But is this something that we aspire to? Yeah, absolutely. Every time we say Shema, we want to get to such a place that if we were really concerned with, what was going on in our wedding night, then we wouldn't be able to summon this correct intent on our wedding night. But every other night of our lives, we should be able to summon that kind of focus and concentrated intent when we say Shema. That is what we need to aspire to. And the reality is, okay, many times, we're just going to say Shema quickly, make sure that we fulfilled our obligation and move on because we're so busy doing what we're doing. But that's not correct, right? What's really correct is that at least twice a day, morning and evening, full stop. The prayers that come before and after help us to cultivate that mindset. But when we get to saying the Shema, it's like full stop everything that's going on in our lives and reconnect with our Creator, reconnect with the Holy One who sent us here on a mission and say, you are one, I am part of you, I submit to you, I give, I submit. Like whatever words you're going to use for that, like you've got to get that focused, right? That is what we're aspiring to. All right, let's continue. The Gemara asks, from where may it be inferred in this verse that a groom is exempt from the mitzvah of Shema? Rav Huna said, the circumstances when one is obligated to recite Shema are like the circumstances when one walks along the way. So just as walking by the way described in the verse is voluntary and involves no mitzvah, right? So walking by the way means not on the path to perform a mitzvah. Walking by the way just means I'm not sitting in my house doing nothing. I'm out in the world, but whether I'm sitting in my house or I'm out in the world, I'm there by my own choice. I've chosen to be where I am. Now, my boss might have told me to sit here at from work. My manager, my team, my coach, my wife, my father, whoever, they might have told me to be here. Okay, but still, I made the choice to obey them, to follow orders, to keep my job, to stay on the team, to be the best I could be, etc. But those are all my choice. As opposed to being on the path to fulfill a commandment that God gave me in the Torah. Right? Then I'm going to be excused from other mitzvahs. But if I'm sitting somewhere or walking somewhere in my house or out in the world and it's my choice to be there, well, then I am obligated in the Shema when the time comes to recite the Shema. So just as walking by the way described in the verse is voluntary and involves no commandment from God, so too all those obligated to recite the Shema are similarly engaged in voluntary activities to the exclusion of this groom who is engaged in the performance of a mitzvah. And that's why the groom is kind of a special situation, because while he's sort of, worried about his wedding night, that concern of his is part of his preparation for that night, right? He's thinking about doing the mitzvah. He's just a little bit worried about whether he's going to do it right, whether she's going to be right, whether it's going to be okay, etc. But he's already engaged in that mitzvah in his worry about that mitzvah. Other mitzvahs are not like that. The Gemara asks, the verse does not specify the way along which one is walking. Are we not dealing with one who is walking along the way for the matter of a mitzvah? Why doesn't it say that you will say the Shema when you walk by the way? Maybe that does imply that you need to say the Shema even when you're engaged in some other mitzvah. You're on the path to perform some other mitzvah. How do we know that's not the case? And nevertheless, the merciful one told us ordered us to recite the Shema even though we're on the path to perform some other mitzvah. Perhaps one is obligated to do so even if he set out to perform a mitzvah. And the Gemara answers, if it is so, that the intention of this verse in the Torah was to obligate even those who are engaged in performance of a mitzvah, well then let the verse state when sitting and when walking. Right? Even when you're sitting or when you're walking, meaning at all times, you're obligated to say the Mishna. Since it shows these words when you're sitting in your house or when you're walking by the way, what is the meaning of when you sit and when you walk? It comes to underscore, to emphasize. It is in your walking, meaning undertaken for personal reasons and of your own volition that you are obligated to recite the Shema. But if you are walking with the objective of performing a commandment that God gave you, a mitzvah, then you are exempt from reciting the Shema. And the Gemara asks, if so, even one who marries a widow should also be exempt, as he too is engaged in the performance of a mitzvah. He is commanded to consummate the marriage with this woman, even though she was married once before. That, however, contradicts the Baraisa. And the Gemara, right, the Baraisa said that he's exempt from reciting Shema on his wedding night if he's marrying a woman who hasn't been married before, but he is obligated in reciting the Shema if he's married a widow that was married before. And so the Gemara responds that there is a distinction between one marrying a virgin and one marrying a widow. One who marries a virgin is preoccupied by his concern, lest he discover that his bride is not a virgin, while one who marries a widow is not preoccupied. So that's the only reason that's stated overtly here. I personally, just from my own understanding, would suggest that that is not his only concern as he's preparing for his wedding night, particularly if he's never been married before. The Gemara asks, and wherever one is preoccupied, is he indeed exempt? But if that is so, then one whose ship sank at sea, who is preoccupied, should also be exempt. Now, this doesn't mean that he was on a ship and the ship sank and he's out there on a raft. What this means is he had like a lot of money invested in a venture that involved a ship at sea, and that ship sank. So now maybe he's lost all his money, right? He's broke. He had a business venture, it collapsed, and now he's broke. That person is preoccupied. The Gemara reinforces its question. And if you say that indeed it is so, but didn't Rabbi Abba Bar Zavda say that Rav said, a mourner is obligated in all the mitzvahs mentioned in the Torah, including reciting the Shema, except for the mitzvah of wrapping tefillin, right? Tefillin, the leather strap that we wrap around our arm, the one that goes over our heads. Really, the black strap is attached to the black box that contains verses of the Torah, one on the arm, one on the head. That's also part of the Shema, that these words which I command you on this day, you shall bind them as a sign upon your hand, and they shall be a symbol before your eyes. That is tefillin. Now, according to this Rabbi Abba Bar Zavda, in the name of Rav, a mourner, so somebody who has just had a very close relative, a parent, a spouse, a child, a sibling, die, they are obligated in all the mitzvahs, including reciting the Shema. The only one they're not obligated in is wrapping tefillin, which we do in the mornings. Why? So a mourner is obligated in all the mitzvahs mentioned in the Torah, including reciting the Shema, except for the mitzvah to wrap tefillin, from which he is exempt. Why? Because the term splendor is associated with regard to tefillin. If a mourner who is clearly pained and preoccupied is nevertheless obligated to recite Shema, then certainly all others who are preoccupied, even one whose ship sank at sea, meaning even one who lost his fortune in a business venture, and whose loss was merely monetary as compared to the one who lost a living relative, all the more he should be obligated. Why then is a groom exempted due to his preoccupation and one who lost his property is not. And the Gemara answers, nevertheless, there is a distinction between the cases. Here, in the case of a groom, he is preoccupied with the preoccupation of a mitzvah that he must perform. There, in the case of the ship lost at sea or the loss of money in a business venture, the person is preoccupied with the preoccupation of a voluntary act that he chooses to perform. Okay, no one, the Torah didn't obligate him to invest in that business venture. He thought it would be a good idea. Unfortunately, it didn't work out. Now he lost a lot of money, but the thing that's filling his mind with worry and concern and preoccupation is not the fact that he must perform a mitzvah. So that's different than the groom who's preoccupied about how the wedding night is going to go. Now the Gemara asks, and is the legal principle, the halachic principle, that one who is engaged in a mitzvah is exempt from performing another mitzvah, is that derived from this conversation that we're having right now? Actually, it is derived from there, as it is taught in a baraisa. From where do we know that one who is engaged in performing a particular mitzvah is excused from performing other mitzvahs? How do we know that? It is derived from the Numbers 9:6, right? The fourth book of the Torah, Numbers chapter 9, verse 6. And this is the incident, and we discussed this when we were in Tractate Pesachim, talking about the laws of Passover and the laws of Pesach Sheni, the second Passover, right? And the verse said, there were certain men who were tameh, ritually impure, by the corpse of a person, and they could not observe Pesach on that day. They could not observe the Pesach, the Paschal Lamb, on that day. So these people had been engaged in very holy work, tending to the burial of a corpse, and because of that, they became ritually impure. And their seventh day of impurity, which would have, at the end of their 7 days of impurity, they would become ritually pure again, and they could participate in the Pesach. But their seventh day fell on that afternoon when they would have been obligated to be registered to the Korban Pesach, the Paschal Lamb, and have it slaughtered that afternoon, and then they would eat it that night. So even though they were going to be ritually pure that night at the time of eating, they were still ritually impure at the time of slaughtering the Paschal Lamb. Before they even touched the corpse, they went to Moses and they said, if we attend to this corpse, our seventh day of impurity is going to fall on the day of slaughtering the Paschal Lamb. Should we still attend to the corpse? And Moses checked with God and said, yes, go attend to the corpse. That's the most important thing, the dignity of the burial of this corpse. Even though you're going to be impure, then Moses checked further with God. So what's going to become of these guys? And God said, for these guys, they're going to have a second opportunity to observe the commandment of the Paschal Lamb 1 month later. And that's Pesach Sheni, the second Passover that comes 1 month later on the 14th of Iyar, 1 month later. And that's for people who are impure on the day of Passover. And that's this incident. So there were certain men who were impure by the corpse of a person, and they could not observe the Pesach on that day. Before proceeding with the discussion, the Baraisa seeks to clarify with regard to those men who became impure. Who were they? The Baraisa answers, they were the bearers of Joseph's coffin. Right? So remember, Joseph, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, who was sold by his brothers into slavery, ended up becoming a slave in Egypt, was eventually thrown in prison, and there, because of his talent for interpreting dreams, interpreted the dream of one of Pharaoh's advisors, and then when Pharaoh had a dream he couldn't interpret, they brought Joseph up out of prison, dressed him up quickly. He interpreted Pharaoh's dream accurately, and Pharaoh made him the vizier, right, the second in command of all of Egypt, and the whole story. And that's how the Jews ended up in Egypt. And Joseph was eventually died and buried in Egypt. But he made his brothers swear to him and his children swear to him that eventually when God would redeem and take the Jews out of Egypt, that they should take his bones out of Egypt with them and eventually bury them in the Holy Land in Israel. So when the children of Israel were wandering in the desert, they had Joseph's bones with them. So the first answer to this question, who are these guys who are impure by reason of touching a corpse and who are therefore going to be impure at the time of the Pesach? The first answer is these were the guys who were carrying Joseph's coffin. This is the statement of Rabbi Yosei HaGalili. Rabbi Akiva says, no, they were Mishael and Elzaphan, who were engaged in carrying the bodies of Nadav and Avihu, the older sons of Aaron, Moses' brother, the high priest. His sons were priests, not the high priest, but they brought strange fire into the Holy of Holies, and their souls, were taken from them. Their bodies were not burned up, but their souls were consumed. They died instantly because they brought some kind of strange fire into the sanctuary that they shouldn't have. And then their bodies needed to be buried. So according to Rabbi Akiva, these guys who were impure by reason of touching a corpse were the ones who were burying Nadav and Avihu. Rabbi Yitzhak said, you're both wrong. Rabbi Yosei HaGalili and Rabbi Akiva are wrong because if they were the bearers of Joseph's coffin, they could have already been purified. They were camped at Sinai sufficient time to become purified in time to sacrifice the Paschal lamb. And if they were Mishael and Elzaphan, they could have already been purified as the tabernacle was erected on the first of the month of Nisan, which was the 8th day of the inauguration, and when the sons of Aaron were burned. So there was enough time for them to tend to those bodies, right? Bodies are supposed to be buried in one day if possible. And then they could have become pure in time for the Paschal lamb. More than 7 days remained until the eve of Passover on the 14th of Nisan. Rather, says Rabbi Yitzhak, these men were unnamed people who were engaged in tending to a corpse whose burial is a mitzvah, i.e., which has no one else available to bury it. It's a person who died with no family. And so these guys stepped in and said, okay, we will bury it. And their 7th day of impurity occurred precisely on the eve of Passover, as it is stated, and they could not observe the Pesach on that day. And the Gemara infers on that day they could not observe it. On the next day, they could have observed it. Although they would be purified at nightfall and would then be eligible to partake in the Paschal lamb at the time of eating it, at the time of slaughtering the Paschal lamb and sprinkling the blood inside the tabernacle, they were not yet pure. So they asked whether the Paschal lamb could be slaughtered on their behalf. Let somebody else slaughter it, and they would just show up for eating it that night. But apparently they were obligated to perform the mitzvah of burial of the corpse, although it prevented them from fulfilling the mitzvah of sacrificing the Paschal lamb, which is a stringent mitzvah. And this is the source for the principle that one engaged in the performance of a mitzvah is exempt from performing another mitzvah. Because they were engaged in burying a corpse, they were excused from participating in the sacrificing of the Paschal lamb. Now, there is the fact that in that case, there's a second opportunity then for them a month later. And in fact, God created that law on behalf of these guys. But our sages are taking that general principle. If you're engaged in performing a mitzvah, you don't have to stop and do some other mitzvah. You can just stay focused on the mitzvah that you're involved in performing. Now, the Gemara answers, both sources are necessary, both sources of this law, as if it had taught us there in the case of impurity imparted by a corpse, the conclusion would have been that the exemption from sacrificing the Paschal lamb is due to the fact that the time of the obligation of the Pesach had not yet arrived when they were obligated to bury the corpse, and therefore they proceeded to fulfill the mitzvah that they encountered first, right? Like they were going to still be impure on their 7th day when it was the time to slaughter the lamb. But burying the corpse, that happened a week earlier, right? That was the mitzvah in front of them. They knew that there would be a conflict with slaughtering the lamb a week later, but at that moment, they needed to bury the corpse. That was the mitzvah they encountered first. However, here, where the time to recite the Shema had already arrived during the wedding, say, no, the groom is not exempt. Right? The groom might be preoccupied with what he's going to do on the wedding night in terms of consummating the marriage, but the time to recite the evening Shema will come first. So why is he exempt from the Shema? Maybe he should say the Shema and then go back to worrying about what's going to happen later. And the answer is no, he's exempt. And if it had taught us here with regard to the Shema The conclusion would have been that the exemption from the Shema is due to the fact that it is not a stringent mitzvah, as there is no charis administered to one who fails to fulfill it. However, there, with regard to the Paschal Lamb, where there is charis meaning death at the hands of the heavenly court, right? You must observe this mitzvah, and if not, you're imperiling your life. Your life might be cut short. You might get not your full number of years. It's going to be weighed against all your good deeds as well. But the fact is, the Torah says one who doesn't fulfill the mitzvah of the Passover lamb is cut off from his people. Reciting the Shema is absolutely an important positive commandment, but it doesn't say in the Torah that if you don't recite the Shema, that you're going to be cut off from your people. In other words, that you could die a premature death. So therefore, we might have thought that you're excused from saying Shema on your wedding night because the Shema is not that stringent of a mitzvah, but not sacrificing the Passover lamb in its time, that is a much more stringent mitzvah, and so we might have thought that you're not excused from that. And in fact, both of these sources show us that one engaged in one mitzvah is excused from performing another mitzvah. With regard to the matter itself, Rabbi Abba Bar Zavda said that Rav said, a mourner is obligated in all the mitzvahs mentioned in the Torah except for the mitzvah to wrap tefillin, from which a mourner is exempt. Why? Because the term splendor is stated with regard to tefillin, and it is not proper for a mourner to adorn himself in this manner. This is worth remembering if you're a man, Jewish man, and you're wrapping tefillin in the morning like you're supposed to every day except Shabbos and festivals, that when you put the tefillin on, it's not just that you're doing what God told you to do. I put the black box on, I put the black straps on, I put the black box here, got the straps around my head, and I did what I was supposed to do. You can even go a little further and say it's a beautiful spiritual commandment, because what am I really doing? I'm handing my soul the reins to my body. Very nice. That's a way of submitting to God every day, reminding yourself that your body is just, it has the hungers of an animal. It has animal hungers. It wants to eat. It wants to, pursue the whatever is attracted to sexually. It wants to buy stuff. It wants to lord it over other people. It wants to get angry. It has all the wants of the body. The soul is much more spiritually refined. And when we put on tefillin, it's like we're handing the reins of the body, the animal body, to the rider, which is the soul, for at least the time that the tefillin is on. So that's a higher understanding of tefillin. But now we're being given an even higher understanding of tefillin. Tefillin is associated with splendor. Splendor. When you put that tefillin on, you are binding yourself to the Holy One above. And for that, the time that it's wrapped in it, and when you're really performing any mitzvah, it's like you are, bathed in holy light, right? You have the splendor on yourself, and the tefillin is specifically a physical embodiment of that, and it's associated with splendor. And here we're being told it's inappropriate for a mourner to have that splendor on him. Now that only is on the first day of mourning, and from this we learn that the first day is the worst day for a mourner. The next day is still going to be incredibly painful, but it's not as acute as the first day. And so the mourner is only excused from tefillin on the first day of mourning. And where do we learn this about splendor? This is from a verse in Ezekiel. God said to Ezekiel, sigh in silence, make no mourning for the dead, bind your splendor upon you, and put your shoes upon your feet. Ezekiel, who was a prophet, engaged in following God's commandment to prophesy and share his prophecy with the world. Ezekiel was commanded to refrain from mourning for his wife in the manner that others do. God said to Ezekiel, you are obligated to wrap tefillin even while you're in mourning for your wife on the first day of mourning, to the exemption of other people. A prophet engaged in prophecy, he has to wrap his tefillin, have his splendor upon him, even on the first day of mourning. But an average person, a regular person, a non-prophet like all of us, doesn't have to put on tefillin on the day of mourning. on the first day. On a similar note, Rabbi Abba Bar Zafta said that Rav said, a mourner is obligated in the mitzvah of Sukkah. And the Gemara asks, that is obvious. Why would he be exempt? And the Gemara answers, lest you say that Rabbi Abba Bar Zafta said that Rav said that one who is suffering due to his presence in the Sukkah is exempt from the mitzvah of Sukkah. So one could have said that this mourner too is one who is suffering and he also should be exempt. So there's a teaching that if being in the Sukkah causes you real, actual suffering, meaning like you're going to be in a Sukkah in Alaska when it's 40 degrees below zero. All right, so you're not going to be able to celebrate in the Sukkah the way that you're meant to celebrate. You're going to be suffering to be in the Sukkah. So if actually being in the Sukkah is going to make you suffer, then you can't fulfill the mitzvah of dwelling in the Sukkah. So you might have thought, well, the mourner, he is suffering because of his mourning. Therefore, he's he's exempt from dwelling in the Sukkah. But they're making this distinction that if the Sukkah itself is causing you to suffer, being there in the Sukkah is what's causing you to suffer, then you're exempt from being in the Sukkah. But if your suffering is related to something else, like mourning for the dead, then you're not excused from dwelling in the Sukkah during Sukkot. And Rabbi Abba Bar Zafta said that Rav said, the groom and the groomsmen and all the members of the wedding party who participate in the wedding celebration, they're all exempt from the mitzvah of Sukkah for all 7 days of the wedding celebration. So the Gemara asks, what is the reason that they are exempt? It is because they wish to rejoice. Well, don't we rejoice when we're in the Sukkah? And the Gemara asks, what is the reason that they are exempt? It is because they wish to rejoice. And the Gemara asks, well, then let them eat in the Sukkah and rejoice in the Sukkah. And the Gemara answers, the celebration of a wedding is only in the wedding home, where the newlyweds reside after the marriage ceremony. And the Gemara asks, well, so let them eat in the Sukkah like everyone else and then rejoice in the wedding home. And the Gemara answers, there is joy only in the place where there is a meal. Therefore, since the celebration must be in the home of the newlyweds, the meal must also be there. Now, obviously, we have weddings that are not in the dwelling place where the bride and groom are going to live. So what is going on here? The groom and groomsmen with regard to the mitzvah of Sukkah, that's actually a different teaching. Groom and groomsmen with regard to the mitzvah of Sukkah, the groom and his groomsmen are exempt from the mitzvah of Sukkah in accordance with the opinion of Rav. However, the halachic authorities of recent generations adopt the opinion of the Rosh and the Meiri, who rule in accordance with the statement of Rabbi Zera that the groom should fulfill the mitzvah of Sukkah. So just as we don't expect all weddings to be in the house where the bride and groom are going to live, likewise, we don't excuse the groom from dwelling in the Sukkah. So if the wedding is going to be around the time of Sukkot, there should be a Sukkah nearby so that they can at least eat some meal in the Sukkah, even if there's going to be a bigger celebration somewhere else. But really, if you're going to have your wedding during Sukkot, you should have a big Sukkah so that everyone can celebrate in the Sukkah for the celebration of the wedding. Where am I? And the Gemara asks, well, let them establish the wedding home in the Sukkah. And Abaye says, this may not be done due to the prohibition against seclusion of the bride with a man other than her husband, as the Sukkah was often established on a rooftop. If the groom went downstairs at any point, the bride could find herself alone in the Sukkah with some other man. And Rava said the reason is due to the suffering of the groom. Since the Sukkah is not enclosed on all sides, he will be unable to enjoy privacy with his bride. And the Gemara asks, what is the practical difference between these? And the Gemara answers, the practical difference between these views is in the case where people regularly enter and leave the Sukkah. According to the one who said that the reason is due to the prohibition against being alone together, well, there is no room for concern in that case. The bride will never find herself alone with just one other man. However, according to the one who said that the reason is due to the suffering of the groom, that he would like to have privacy with his bride, there is room for concern if people are constantly coming and going. And we have a note here from Rav Steinsaltz. Various reasons have been suggested to explain why a groom is exempt from the mitzvah of Sukkah. According to Rashi, there is insufficient room in a Sukkah for the groom to be alone with his bride. Even if it's a big Sukkah. Most commentaries explain that it is due to the fact that the groom wants his friends to share with him in the joy of the wedding, and he is distressed because there is generally insufficient room for all of this celebration in a Sukkah, right? You want to invite a lot of people to the wedding, and sukkahs are usually not that big, right? Even if you have a big sukkah, it's not big enough for a whole wedding celebration. So they don't have to have that meal in the sukkah. Let them just have their wedding celebration. Others say the reason for the exemption of a groom for the mitzvah of sukkah is that at that moment he is technically engaged in performance of the mitzvah to cheer his wife and rejoice with her, and this exempts him from the different mitzvah, the different commandment of dwelling in the sukkah. Rabbi Zeir has said, I married on the eve of the festival of Sukkot, and I ate in the sukkah, and I rejoiced in the wedding home, and all the more so my heart rejoiced as I fulfilled 2 mitzvahs that night, the mitzvah of marriage and its accompanying celebration, and the mitzvah of Sukkah. Nevertheless, Rabbi Zeir's point was, I'm a sage, I did it this way, you don't have to do it that way. And so generally speaking, a groom is excused in the mitzvah of Sukkah. At least that's how it was in the times of the Gemara. In modern times, the groom is not excused from the mitzvah of Sukkah. So with that in mind, maybe that people won't schedule the wedding to coincide with Sukkah. And the sages taught the groom and the groomsmen and all the members of the wedding party are exempt from the mitzvah of prayer and from the mitzvah of tefillin because they are unable to muster the requisite intentionality due to their excess of joy and levity, but they are obligated in the commandment to recite the Shema. I should have warned you, I'm just about done. I have 1 sentence left to read, so if you have questions or comments, get them in. In the name of Rabbi Shela, they taught a groom is exempt from the mitzvah of Shema, but the groomsmen and all the members of the wedding party are obligated. They might be excused from Sukkah, but they have to say Shema, even if the groom himself is not, because they're not preoccupied with consummating a marriage that night. Only the groom has that preoccupation. All right, that's what I've got for us this evening. Let us go to your questions and comments. Okay, Lucy, since there is nothing about the bride, I guess nothing written about the bride, I'm assuming that women are not obligated to say the Shema. Right, so we've discussed this before. Saying Shema morning and evening is a time-bound positive commandment, and women are excused from time-bound positive commandments. Presumably because they have other pressing matters like, screaming kids who, let's face it, they're going to call for mom before they call for dad, and mom has to be free to attend to their needs, even if she would rather be praying and even declaring God's oneness. So yes, women are not obligated in the Shema. However, there's a lot more nuance to that, that generally, women, according to some opinions, are obligated to pray twice a day. Now, that's talking about the standing prayer, the Amidah. Should you say Shema in the morning? Should you say Shema at night before you go to bed? Plenty of opinions say women are obligated in that. Others say that it depends. So, I'm just not expert enough in that law, and I don't have it on the tip of my tongue. I probably should have looked it up before tonight. But definitely that is a question easily Googled. Are women obligated in the commandment of Shema? You will get a lot more information, and you'll see it's not a simple answer. Sharon, my understanding is that even though it is a time-bound positive commandment, women are obligated in both the Shema and morning and evening Amidah, but not the afternoon prayer of Mincha. Nina notes there's a different opinion, Rei the Amidah. According to Nina's women's siddur, Mincha is a higher priority. The afternoon prayer is a higher priority than the evening prayer. So I think you will find opinions that say women are obligated, morning and evening Shema. Women are obligated in Amidah, morning and evening. But like I said, there's more nuance to it. That's a topic, if you're a woman, if you're a Jewish woman, it's worth reading up on that topic. And like many topics where the law is not so cut and dry, it's not so simple, that's something like you learn it and go back and learn it again, and later go back and learn it again, because like even in just looking up these laws, you will learn interesting spiritual lessons. Tom, are there other mitzvahs, other commandments that the ritually impure may not perform at the specified time, and for which they are given a second chance later? I don't know that there's like the direct laying out in the Torah of a second chance later the way there is like for the actual second Passover, right? Pesach Sheni, there's first Passover and second Passover. I can't think of an example like that offhand. But generally speaking, there are times when you're obligated, when the temple is standing, there are times when you're obligated to bring a sacrifice, to bring a sin offering, to bring a guilt offering, to bring a burnt offering. Not a burnt offering, I think those are voluntary. But sin offerings and guilt offerings, there are times when you're obligated to bring them. If you are impure, you cannot enter the temple compound until you become purified. So even though there might be a time to do it, if you're impure, you can't do it. So you're just going to do it at the first opportunity later. And that is the way that is taught. A circumcision, right? If the baby is not healthy to have its 8th day circumcision, so then you're going to do it on the first day that is available. An 8th day circumcision overrides even Shabbos, when we're normally not allowed to draw blood. But if the baby's not well, or the knife wasn't there, it wasn't possible to perform that mitzvah on that day, then you're going to do it at the next possible opportunity. But if the next possible opportunity is Shabbos, it no longer overrides Shabbos. So you have to wait one more day. And generally speaking, the punishment for not fulfilling a positive commandment, thou shalt, as opposed to a thou shalt not, the punishment for not observing positive commandments is much lower than the punishment for transgressing negative commandments, because you can always fix the fact that you neglected to fulfill a positive mitzvah by fulfilling it when you get a chance. So it's kind of like understood that there's always that second chance. You didn't do something you were supposed to do, so do it the next time you get that opportunity. Make an atonement for the fact that you didn't do it when you could, but you're going to have another chance to do it, God willing, and then do it, right? As opposed to when you did something you weren't supposed to do, well, then you did it, right? You've already made that sin. And then it's going to be a different kind of atonement, including bringing a sin offering in appropriate cases to make up for that. Let me just check if there's anything else I should take a look at. I don't think so. Okay, so that is what I've got for us this evening. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Again, giving the same heads up I gave last night, we'll have class at the regular time this week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. And then I'm going to be away for a week until the following Friday when I'm back to give another class. So from this coming Thursday until the following Friday after that, 8 days, I'm going to be gone visiting my family and trying out for Team USA to go to the Maccabiah games. I won't be able to teach the class while I'm away. I will do a highlights show when I come back, but I will try to post some concepts from the pages while I'm gone. I won't have access to the video equipment to do it while I'm away, but I will do the reading, and I'll try to post some key concepts during the days that I'm away. Okay, my friends, great learning with you on a Sunday night. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night. Have an awesome evening.